I discovered my wife's betrayal at a party when I catches her in an intimate moment with her boss. Devastated by the affair, I file for divorce and struggles with the painful process of co-parenting. In time, me finds healing, letting go of the past and reclaiming his life. The night was crisp and excitement hung in the air. It was the annual company gala, and this year's celebration felt especially significant. Sarah, my wife of 8 years, had just received a major promotion. She was now a senior executive at her firm, and I couldn't have been more proud. Her success was our success. We had spent the last few months getting ready for the party, and it felt like the culmination of all her hard work. I was looking forward to a fun night, the kind where I could cheer on my wife, meet new colleagues, and indulge in the luxury of a well-organized corporate event. We arrived at the venue, a lavish ballroom filled with dim lighting and glimmering chandeliers. Sarah, radiant in a sleek black dress, was the star of the night. She moved through the crowd with grace, accepting congratulations from colleagues and higher-ups, flashing her trademark smile. I took my place by her side, thrilled by her achievements, but I couldn't help but notice that Sarah was acting a little different tonight. Not in a major way, but there was an air of distraction around her. She seemed more caught up in her conversations with her boss, Mr. Blake, than usual. I dismissed it at first. Maybe it was just the excitement of the promotion. Mr. Blake was a charming man, always kind to me, and he had been instrumental in Sarah's career advancement. But as the evening wore on, I started noticing the little things. The way Sarah's eyes lingered a second longer than necessary when speaking with Mr. Blake, the way her laughter seemed almost too sincere, too flirtatious. I tried to ignore it. After all, what could possibly be going on? She was my wife. We shared everything. The night continued, and I even managed to get lost in conversation with a few other guests. But something gnawed at me, a suspicion creeping into the back of my mind. The sight of Sarah's hand brushing against Mr. Blake's during their private conversation, her laughter ringing out a little too loudly, made me uneasy. But I shook it off. After all, Sarah and I had built a solid, trusting relationship over the years. This was just a bit of overthinking on my part. Or so I thought. Little did I know, the perfect night would soon unravel into something unrecognizable. And it was happening right in front of my eyes. As the party progressed, my unease only deepened. I caught glimpses of Sarah and Mr. Blake, always together, always whispering and laughing like they shared some private joke. It was subtle, but undeniable. She was more focused on him than on me. It wasn't as though I thought anything was happening, but there was something off about their dynamic. At one point, I went to the bar to get a drink. As I stood there, waiting for the bartender, I overheard snippets of conversation between Sarah and Mr. Blake. Her voice, usually so warm and comforting, had a different tone when she spoke to him, a playful, almost coy edge to it. "Maybe we should celebrate our success, just the two of us," Mr. Blake said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. Sarah laughed lightly. "Maybe we should, but I don't think that's a good idea right now." Her response was casual, but I could hear the subtle flirtation beneath it. I felt a pang of discomfort, but I brushed it off. It could have been nothing, but the more I tried to ignore it, the more I realized how distant Sarah had become. She wasn't the same woman I had married. She was distracted, always checking her phone, always finding reasons to slip away from me. The physical distance between us was growing. When we did talk, it felt forced, like there was a wall between us. Her smile seemed less genuine. At one point, as we were mingling with a few colleagues, Sarah's phone buzzed on the table. I glanced at it, but she quickly snatched it up before I could get a good look. It was a small moment, but the tension in my chest grew. Something wasn't right. I didn't know what it was yet, but I could feel it. The creeping suspicion that something was slipping through my fingers. I tried to stay calm, to not jump to conclusions. After all, there were no definitive signs. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the perfect picture of our marriage was starting to crack. By the time the party was winding down, I couldn't take it any longer. My gut was telling me something I didn't want to hear. I had to know what was going on. I decided to step outside for a breather, away from the noise and confusion of the party. I walked through a quiet hallway, the cool air of the evening hitting my face as I leaned against the wall. It was then that I overheard something that made my stomach drop. The voices were soft but unmistakable. It was Sarah and Mr. Blake. They were right around the corner, and their conversation was heated. "I can't stop thinking about you," I heard Mr. Blake's voice, hushed but intense. "You know I want you." My heart froze. I could feel the blood drain from my face as I stood there, unable to move. What was happening? "I know," Sarah replied, her voice low, almost breathless. "But we can't. Not like this." The words were a slap to my face, each one more painful than the last. Sarah was flirting with him. More than flirting. I had caught them, right in the middle of the party, in the most intimate exchange I could have ever imagined. I wanted to confront them then and there, but my legs wouldn't move. Instead, I took a deep breath and pushed open the door, my eyes locking with Sarah's. She gasped, stepping back as if she had seen a ghost. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us deafening. Then, with a voice trembling with hurt and anger, I asked, "What is this, Sarah? What's going on?" The color drained from her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes flickered to Mr. Blake, who stood there, silently acknowledging the truth. In that moment, everything I had known, everything I believed about our marriage, came crashing down. I don't remember how long we stood there in that small, quiet room. My mind was a whirlwind, but one thing was clear. I couldn't pretend this wasn't happening. Sarah had been hiding something, and now I knew the painful truth. I took a step forward. "How long, Sarah? How long has this been going on?" She shifted uncomfortably. It's not what you think," she stammered, her voice shaking. But I wasn't buying it. I turned to Mr. Blake. You've been using her, haven't you? How could you do this to me?" The anger, the hurt, and the betrayal spilled out. I had always trusted him, had always believed that he was a mentor to Sarah. But now I saw him for what he really was, a man who had taken advantage of my trust. Mr. Blake's face hardened, and he shrugged. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. It was just a mistake." His calmness infuriated me even more. Sarah began to cry, her tears a mix of regret and guilt. "I'm so sorry, John. I never meant for you to find out this way. It's just, I've felt so distant lately, and Mr. Blake, he understood me." But it wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal, a deep, deliberate act of deceit. No amount of tears could change the fact that everything I had believed in was shattered. The confrontation left me numb. Sarah begged me for forgiveness, telling me that it was all her fault, that she had been going through a difficult time at work. She said she didn't know how it had escalated, but I didn't want to hear any of it. "You don't get it," she said, her voice quivering. I was overwhelmed. I felt like you weren't there for me anymore. Mr. Blake. He was just there when I needed someone. Her words were excuses, nothing more. She talked about how our relationship had been strained, how she felt emotionally distant from me, but all I could hear was the deafening sound of her betrayal. Her guilt was apparent, but the damage had been done. "I thought you loved me," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I do," she cried, "but I didn't know how to fix things. I'm sorry, John, I swear. Please, let me make it right." But nothing could make it right. The trust was gone, the bond was broken, and no amount of apologies could undo the damage. The next few hours were a blur. My mind was spinning, and my heart was in pieces. Was in pieces. I couldn't believe what had just happened. The shock of the confrontation still reverberated through me. I kept replaying the scene over and over in my head, the way Sarah had cried, the way Mr. Blake had stood there, unmoved, as though our entire marriage was just another business transaction to him. I needed space, time to process everything. Sarah was still in the room, trying to apologize, to explain, but her words felt like hollow echoes. I couldn't hear her. I couldn't even look at her without feeling my stomach turn. I stood up, numb, and walked out of the room, leaving them behind. I walked through the hotel lobby in a daze, not knowing where to go or what to do. My phone buzzed constantly, with messages from friends and colleagues who were still at the party. I knew I had to go back, but I couldn't face anyone right now. I was living in a nightmare, and everything felt surreal. My wife, the woman I had loved and trusted for so long, had betrayed me in the most painful way possible. It was a gut punch, and I didn't know how to breathe without the pain threatening to suffocate me. After some time, I returned to the room where Sarah was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale and tear-streaked. Mr. Blake was gone. It was just the two of us now. The silence between us was deafening. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "You didn't just betray me," I said, my voice low and steady, though the hurt was cutting through me. "You betrayed our entire life. Everything I've built, everything we've built, you threw it all away for a man who couldn't care less about us." Tears welled up in her eyes again, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy. How could I? "You don't get it, John. I was lost. I didn't know who I was anymore. He made me feel wanted, special." "But I made you feel loved, didn't I?" I shot back. "I thought we had something special. Wasn't that enough?" She nodded, choking back sobs. "It wasn't. I thought it would be, but I was too caught up in my own pain. I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen." But I didn't believe her. The damage was too deep. This wasn't just a slip-up. It was a choice she made repeatedly over time. My trust in her had been shattered, and no apology would ever be enough to fix it. I spent the rest of the evening in a state of numbness. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. How could I lay beside the woman who had just torn apart my world? The betrayal still burned inside me, gnawing at my insides. I felt hollow. The next morning, we didn't speak much. There was no need. The truth had been laid bare. I wanted out. In the days that followed, Sarah tried to salvage our marriage. She called, texted, and sent messages of regret, trying to explain herself in every possible way. She told me that she had made a mistake, that she would do anything to fix things, but I couldn't listen to it anymore. It was like a broken record, the same tired excuses, the same empty promises. But it wasn't just the affair that had broken me. It was the lies, the betrayal of our life together, the disrespect she had shown for everything I had believed in. We had spent years building a future, a partnership, a family, and in one moment, all of it had come crumbling down. How could I ever look at her the same way again? How could I ever trust her again? I made the decision to file for divorce. It wasn't something I had thought would ever happen. Divorce was never in our vocabulary. We had always been a team, in good times and bad. But now, there was no team. There was just me, standing alone in the wreckage of what used to be. I remember the moment I called a lawyer, the weight of it pressing on my chest. There was no turning back. This was the end of the road for us. I couldn't live in a marriage that was built on a lie, no matter how much I had once loved her. When I told Sarah, she broke down again. She begged me not to go through with it, swearing that things would be different, that she would change. But I had made up my mind. There was no coming back from this. I wanted to make sure the divorce was as amicable as possible for the sake of our future, and, if we were ever able to, our children. But every interaction with Sarah felt like it chipped away at my heart. I couldn't look at her without seeing Mr. Blake's face in the back of my mind. The divorce was finalized after a few months. The aftermath was just as painful as I had feared. I felt like I was losing everything, not just the love of my life, but also the idea of the family we had created. I had a deep hole in my heart, and I didn't know how to fill it. But the real challenge began when we had to learn how to co-parent. There were no more romantic dates, no more holidays as a family. There were just awkward exchanges over custody arrangements, school events, and the never-ending task of making sure our kids were shielded from the worst of the fallout. We tried, for the sake of the children, to be civil, but it was difficult. Every time I saw Sarah, I was reminded of her betrayal. And every time I had to hand over our kids to her for the weekend, I felt that same old anger rising up inside me. Still, we tried to put our differences aside for the kids. They needed us both, even if we couldn't stand to be in the same room. We kept the focus on them, on their well-being, and slowly, things began to settle into a routine. But it wasn't easy. It was a constant struggle to keep the bitterness from spilling over into our interactions. Despite the anger and the pain, I started to heal. It wasn't quick, but with time, I began to rebuild my life. I started seeing a therapist, and through counseling, I realized that my self-worth wasn't tied to Sarah's actions. I was worthy of love, of trust, and of happiness, even if it meant moving on without her. Months passed, and I thought I was finally getting my life back on track. I had started dating again, cautiously opening my heart to the possibility of love. I had learned not to carry the burden of Sarah's betrayal anymore. But then, one evening, I ran into her at a cafe. She was sitting with a man I didn't recognize. It was strange seeing her with someone else. At first, I didn't know what to feel. Anger? Jealousy? Or was it just the painful reminder of what I had lost? I watched from a distance as she laughed, as she looked at him the way she used to look at me. I realized in that moment that Sarah had moved on. She had found someone else to share her life with, someone who didn't know the pain of her betrayal. It was a slap in the face, but it was also a wake-up call. She was no longer my problem, my responsibility. She had her own life now. I had mine. After that encounter, I finally realized something. I had to let go. I had been holding on to the pain, to the anger, to the broken pieces of a life that no longer existed. It wasn't helping me heal. It was only keeping me stuck in the past. I made the decision to fully let go of the past, to forgive Sarah, not for her, but for myself. It wasn't about excusing her actions. It was about freeing myself from the weight of the betrayal. As I moved forward, I started to find peace. I focused on my career, on my children, and on myself. I wasn't the same person I had been when Sarah and I first met, but I was stronger. I had survived the worst, and I was finally starting to feel whole again. I still think about Sarah from time to time, but I don't let her define me anymore. My life is mine to live, and with each passing day, I move closer to the person I want to become, someone who no longer carries the burden of betrayal, but walks forward with hope. Thank you for watching, and if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please do so and press the notification bell. This way, you'll stay updated with more shocking real-life stories.